Welcome to Storytime here in Lockdown. I would tell you what episode this is, but I am lost. I don't know, 28, 29, something. I'd like to wish a happy birthday to a friend of mine who's happily demolishing the inside of a new house. And I honestly think that with the day that I've had today, if it weren't for social distancing and lockdown, I would have gone over and pleaded to go swing a hammer at something. But as it stands, happy birthday in isolation. So, interestingly enough, as I read these stories, I find that some of them were really important stories for my kids, and I wrote them when they were little at a time when I told them these stories. I don't know, this one's for Ian, this first one. And it's called Amazing Grace. No, not the song. Ian wears glasses, if you know Ian at all. But what you might not know is that when he was in pre-K and kindergarten, we had moved off our sailboat from Florida to New Jersey, to Medford, New Jersey. And the preschool teacher took me aside when it was time to talk about grades and everything. Yeah, preschool, they had grades. And she told me she didn't think my Ian was all that bright. Yeah, that went well. I don't know what people think sometimes. She said, I don't know. I said, what's the problem? She said, he doesn't pay attention. I think he's really smart, probably, maybe, but, whenever I try and point out stuff at the board, he looks the other way. And so I took little Ian by the hand. I sat him down in the corner of the classroom. I said, honey, the teacher says that you're not paying attention to what's on the board. And he says, there isn't anything on the board. I said, well, there's stuff on the board now. He says, no, there isn't. And he was sitting way in the back of the class, and I bet you know where this is going. Yeah, he couldn't see that board. He couldn't see anything on the board. So we took him to the optometrist that weekend. And then he got glasses a week later. And when we put the eyeglasses, I'm going to lose it on this one. There's no way. I'm going to not boo-hoo. So when Ian put on his eyeglasses and he walked out the front door of that optometrist's office, it was springtime. And he looked up and he freaked out. And he's like, what's all that stuff? Oh, Mommy, what are those, the things? I'm like, the trees? He's like, those are the trees. He goes, what's all over them? I was like, what do you mean what's all over the trees? He said, Mommy, with his new glasses for the first time ever, Mommy, what are those things all over the trees that are moving? I said, the leaves? He said, yeah, what's that stuff up there? I said, what stuff up? Where? Well, it's blue, but they're white things, and the white things are moving. I never saw those before. He had never seen leaves or clouds, and he was absolutely sure that trees just vanished into thin air halfway or a third of the way up. And so he was being really bullied in school because everybody thought he wasn't very bright. Problem was that he couldn't see the board. And when he could see the board, he couldn't see what was on the board. So I wrote this one for him. There, I didn't cry. It's called Amazing Grace. In a big city park near the lake, squirrels were a very common sight. They were often seen scurrying after bits of food that passers-by had dropped and then scampering up the trees with their prizes. One afternoon, a little squirrel came out from under a bush in search of food. At first glance, this squirrel looked like any other squirrel with its brown and white coat. On closer inspection, one could see that this squirrel had a rather strange look about it. His eyes were much larger than those of other squirrels, and his body seemed wider and a bit flat, almost like he was a tiny moving carpet rather than a chubby little squirrel. The little fellow was named Tucker, and he didn't seem to be aware of the fact that he might be in danger of being stepped on or caught by a passing cat. Tucker moved slowly, and he seemed to stare around as if he was thinking very, very hard about what to do next. He was thinking, focus, 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 focus. Look and look until you see what you need. Finally, he would spy his target, a piece of popcorn spilled by a child, and once he spotted it, he moved like a streak of brown and white lightning to grab it and shimmy underneath another bush. Still, all that looking took a great deal of time. The other squirrels watched Tucker and his hunt every day, and every day they laughed and they jeered at him. "Scaredy squirrel, slow poke," they called from the trees. "Too scared to go fast, too scared to climb the tall trees to gather nuts. You are the slowest squirrel in the park." Now, this was very unfair because it wasn't that Tucker was afraid. The problem was that Tucker couldn't see very well. He himself did not know that this was the problem, for he thought that everyone saw the same way that he did. When Tucker looked at the park, all he saw was bright, blurry wash of colors and shapes. If he wanted to see one thing in all of that mess, he had to stare very hard and concentrate until the thing and the shapes came into focus. Tucker thought that all animals did this, so he just never thought much about it. Also, he was very confused about why other squirrels climbed up to the tops of trees, because Tucker did not do this, because with his sight, he didn't know that the trees had tops. Tucker thought that any squirrel that climbed to the top of a tree just became invisible, and not liking that idea very much, he chose to stay on the ground. Also, the daylight just hurt his big eyes quite a lot. Unfortunately, Tucker was also afraid of the dark. It had been dark when he was scooped from his nest in the country and placed in a tiny cage and carried to the city. It had been dark when he realized that he was alone in the world. It had been dark when the man who had stolen him away moved him into a big cage in the city park zoo. He'd lived in the dark cage in the zoo for so long, such a long, long time, all alone, just curled up and hiding. Finally, his keepers let him go in the big park at night, saying, "This one doesn't seem to like it here very much. Yeah, we're going to have to find another one." So he went against his nature, and he became a day-hunting ground squirrel. As the years went by, the constant jeers of the others and the effort to see and hunt in the bright light made Tucker a very nervous little creature. Almost every sound made him jump or cry, and one morning Tucker was lying flat on the ground, trying hard to make out the shapes in front of him, when all of a sudden there was a rush of sound and a whoosh of air, and he felt a very large, heavy thing land on him. It was the foot of a giant. Actually, it was the foot of a girl named Grace, who hadn't seen Tucker lying flat and still in her path. When she realized that Tucker had been hurt, she lifted him up and gently carried him away. When Tucker awoke, a whole set of giants was looking down at him. "My name's Grace, and you are very lost, my little friend," one giant blur said. "It's a really rare thing to see a flying squirrel in a big city. To see one out during the day? Wow, that's even more rare. Have you forgotten how to be a flying squirrel or something?" Tucker was confused because squirrels don't fly. The voice that called itself Grace kept on talking to the other big blurs about squirrels that only hunted at night, and it could spread their arms and legs and glide on the air currents from tree to tree. Grace talked about how these animals did not need to see with their big eyes. because they could make a special sound that other animals couldn't hear. And the sound could bounce off the world and come back as a picture in the squirrel's mind. It was by that sound picture that the squirrel could see the world very clearly indeed. "Don't worry, little guy," Grace said to Tucker. "When you're well, we're going to take you back to the park, but until then, we're going to give you food and shelter and love, and we're going to heal you right up." To make Tucker comfortable, Grace put him in a large cage filled with food that smelled wonderful and covered the cage with a dark cloth. And then she even sang to him for a little while before leaving him alone. It was dark. Tucker was afraid. He began to cry and cry and cry until his voice got higher and squeakier. And then it had ever been before, and all of a sudden, Tucker could see everything around him perfectly. He stopped crying, his high-pitched voice, and everything went dark. He began to cry out, and the picture came back into his mind. A sound picture. Tucker thought, "I'm seeing a sound picture. It must be true. I must really be a flying squirrel." He practiced his high sound over and over and over again until he became sleepy. That night, Tucker dreamed about his mother and father, and he dreamed about them flying through the dark skies in the forest he'd come from. He saw that the trees had tops and that other squirrels did not become invisible. He just couldn't see them with his eyes before, but he knew now, that he could see at night with his sound pictures. Alas, Tucker knew he was different. He remembered who he was and where he'd come from. The days went by, and with much attention from Grace, Tucker became well again, and finally Grace carried him back to the park and set him free. Now, Tucker knew better than to go out during the day when the sun hurt his big eyes and would make everything blurry. So he crawled into the hollow of a tree, and he waited for night to fall. Then he hurried out, and he began to climb up the tallest tree in the whole park. "Look, look," called out another squirrel. "Scaredy Squirrel's back, and he's climbing the tall tree." All the other animals in the park, squirrels, pigeons, cats, owls, and mice, gathered at the base of the tree to watch. When all the others were quiet, Tucker began to make his sound. "Oh, man, listen to him crying," shouted one nasty little rat. The others joined him in making fun. "Hush now, all of you," said a white dove that had landed on top of a marble bench in a patch of moonlight. "You have no reason to be so mean. He's never done anything to harm any of you. You just dislike him because he's different. Perhaps if you gave him a chance, you'd learn something about the world." The others became quiet. The only sound was a musical chirping noise that was coming from Tucker, and soon even that sound got high and it disappeared. They all watched as Tucker turned his head from side to side, up and down, catching all the sounds that bounced around his head until he had a very clear picture of the world around him. He knew the exact distance between the trees. He knew just how far he could fly and where he should land. And then Tucker bunched himself up and he sprang free of the tree. But Tucker didn't fall. Instead, he spread his arms and his legs, looking like a tiny kite floating in the air until he landed and clung to the tree far on the opposite side of the path. For a moment, all remained quiet. And then they burst into cheers and whoops. Tucker was so pleased with his flight that he began a whole series of twists and glides from tree to tree. And at last, he landed on the ground in the center of the crowd and made a little bow. All the animals fell silent. Oh, wow. They were ashamed of the way they had misjudged this tiny wonder. One of the ground squirrels stepped forward and asked, how'd you learn to do that? Why did you never fly before? Tucker thought for a moment before he made his reply. It was amazing, really. I met something big and kind called Grace. And Grace helped me to remember who I was and where I came from. And Grace reminded me that I could see with different eyes and that I could fly. From that day on, all the creatures in the park were on the lookout for Grace, because they wanted her to come their way and help them remember who they were, and maybe, just maybe, teach them how to soar. I hope Ian watches that one tonight. Remembers that one. Speaking of memories, this next one's about an elephant. I know we were doing a lot of meadows, a lot of birds, a lot of frogs. So tonight we got flying squirrels and the memory, in memory of the elephant. The jungle was a busy place, filled with creatures on the hunt. Some hunted for food, others for shelter. All looked for answers to the questions of life. Mukeshs, the elephant, was no different from the others. He ate and slept and dreamed and hoped, just as they did. The only difference was that Mukeshs had a wonderful memory for the details of life, and being able to call to mind so many different things, he was thought to be very wise indeed. Mukeshs could remember the cycles of the moon, and so he could tell when the rainy season would come. Being the only elephant in that part of the jungle, the other creatures had no way of knowing that his talent, while impressive, was in no way miraculous. When he was young, Mukeshs tried to tell those around him that anyone could do as he did, but after a while he began to enjoy the attention and the benefits that he received. It was not long before the elephant began to believe what people said about him, that he was better than any animal alive. His manner changed. He was no longer a humble creature willing to use his knowledge to help others learn. Instead of sharing, he became greedy for the riches that he could gain with this knowledge. When two apes came to him and asked, "Oh, wise one, what shall we eat for breakfast today?" Mukeshs found that he was disgusted by their worship of him. He thought, "If they are such fools enough to follow me, then I will feel no sorrow over gaining from their folly." "Show me what you have," Mukeshs said grandly. The monkeys placed 3 bananas and 2 canes of sugar at his massive gray feet. Mukeshs took on a mischievous look. His large gray eyes gleamed. "For the price of 1 banana and 2 sugar canes, I will tell you what you should eat today." The apes paid the price. "You should eat 1 banana for breakfast." "Mukeshs has spoken." And he scooped up his new riches with his trunk. Well, instead of feeling cheated, the 2 monkeys chattered excitedly for all to hear. "See how wise is the great Mukeshs! 1 banana! This is exactly what we have now. The solution was so simple. We should have thought of this for ourselves." Mukeshs was very glad indeed that they had not thought for themselves, as their relying upon him was making him a very happy elephant indeed. He had all the food he would ever need, and his followers built a great palace high on a rise above the jungle. One sunny day, Mukeshs met a bird that had just flown in from a far-off mountain and learned from the bird that a terrible storm was coming. Now, he did not rush to warn the others for the sake of kindness. Oh, no. Instead, he trumpeted the gathering signal with his great trunk, and his followers swarmed on him. "I have had a vision," he announced. "What is this new knowledge worth to you, my faithful ones?" The others began murmuring and wondering what the Great One had seen in his enormous mind. for the price of 2 bananas and 3 cans of sugar. I shall share my wisdom, he said. While some poor animals couldn't raise the goods for the fee, others scurried to and fro, gathering their offerings, and they were told of the coming storm. The animals that did not know the storm was coming were caught in its fury and died. For a moment, Mukeshs looked around on the destruction and felt sadness for those who had perished. But too soon, however, he was beset by followers, thanking and praising him for his wisdom. He turned away from the ones that he had left out in the storm. Time passed, and Mukeshs became the ruler of all that he surveyed. He had so many followers and assistants that he barely ever left his great palace. He would merely speak his latest insights to his helpers, and they would go out to the faithful and collect the tribute. One day, Mukeshs was walking in his gardens when he heard a great commotion on the other side of the garden wall. Save us, please, great one, the voices called. Mukeshs stood on his hind legs, and he peered over the great wall where hundreds of animals had gathered. The hunters' guns have been heard in the distance, said one of the faithful. Give us shelter behind your great palace. Mukeshs was about to do so, but his assistants, a pack of howler monkeys and hyenas, rushed in upon him and insisted that he keep the gates barred. Oh, really, great Mukeshs, said Mel the monkey. It will be too crowded in here for all of these beasts. The hunters, they will pass. Besides, once you let them in, they will see that you live as a mere elephant and not a great god. And all will be lost to you. You will be just an elephant once more. Mukeshs had grown so accustomed to listening to his helpers and believing himself to be all-knowing that he had forgotten how to think for himself. He'd become like so many of his followers. He was desperate for advice, and so he did as he was advised. Returning to the wall, he looked over and he made his announcement. Because you have been so faithful, I will not charge you for this advice. Fear not the hunter's gun, for the hunter will pass. Go home. Mukeshs has spoken. And so it was that the animals went back down the hill and into the jungle, and Mukeshs went back to his garden and his thoughts and his plans. And all was quiet until late that night when the hunter's moon rose high in the sky, and the shrieks and the wails of the animals could be heard with the echoes of the great guns of the huntsmen. Mukeshs hid in his palace until the sunrise and then mustered his very small amount of courage to go down into the jungle below. All was silent, as a thin gray mist clung around his ankles and seeped into the low ferns. As he walked around, the mist cleared, and beneath it he saw the remains of the animals that had once stood before him to seek his wise advice. Seeing them, he became sick and frightened. He turned and he began to charge blindly through the jungle. He wanted to run away. He didn't want to see what he had done, no matter how far or how hard he charged. He could still see their faces. He still heard their cries. And finally, Mukeshs found himself at the great waterfall that spilled down from the towering cliffs above. In exhaustion and misery, he decided to lose himself beneath the pounding water. He knew that the thundering of the falls would drown out these voices in his head. He closed his eyes tight, and he knew that he wouldn't see the faces of the other animals. The water beat down on him and pushed his gray form to the bottom of the river, pinning him there. Then all was quiet. Mukeshs opened his eyes and he looked at the surface of the water. But to his great surprise, he didn't see churning waters and chaos. He saw a glassy mirror of calm hanging above him. In it, he saw reflected his entire life. He saw his gifts and how he'd misused them. He saw each time he'd taken advantage of another creature when he could have used his knowledge to give aid and comfort, not for a price, but for the joy of good grace. And try as he might, he could not drown his sorrows. His huge lungs held the air, as did his trunk, but he could not manage to let go of his last breath. Mukeshs sank a little lower into the mud at the bottom of the river, and he wished with all of his heart that he could forget his failings. I am sorry, my friend, but I do not take back the gifts once given, said a voice in his large ears. Mukeshs blinked and began to thrash in terror, but he couldn't see the source of the voice. The crushing waters kept him pinned to the bottom, and he couldn't struggle free. The voice spoke again. Your gift is your memory, and it is long. It remembers joy and pain alike. Again, Mukeshs called to mind his failings. Yes, you have failed yourself and others, said the voice. Now remember this. I am with you always. I am with those you fail. I am the water of life that you drink, that washes you clean, and that makes the jungle thrive. Hearing these words, Mukeshs felt weak and humble. He stopped struggling and felt himself being pulled along the bottom of the river until he was free of the pressure of the falls. And then he gently rose to the surface and took his first breath. He stood up and found that he felt lighter and smaller. When he looked down at the still water, he didn't see an old, tired elephant, but a young calf. What has happened to me? He asked the shifting wet mirror. The water rippled around his ankles. No, you're not physically young again, the voice said. When you return, others will still see the same old Mukeshs. But you will forever look into the water and see your true self, a child of the water of life. It is a new gift. But I do not deserve a new gift, Mukeshs protested. Ah, my dear one, said the waters. Sometimes the most precious gift is not the one that we deserve, but the one that we need. One who gives from the heart will never forget that that is so. And Mukeshs would always remember. I haven't read that story in 20 years. Now I'm really glad that I was here with you to take it back. There are things that I think we will always remember about these times. And while it's really important to remember all of the bad and the negative things so that we don't repeat them, it's important to remember the people we've lost, like our friend Adolfo Di Martino. It's also important to remember how we all were here together tonight and every night to take back our stories together. Thank you for being here. I'll see you again tomorrow night.